Hi everyone, Janie here. Welcome back to my garden. I think this is my last video in this garden, which is crazy to say. It's so bittersweet, but by the time you all see this, if everything works out right, tomorrow should be my very first garden tour video of my new garden. So everything went great. The sale closed, the sale of our house closed, and we are officially owners of a new home, and this home is no longer ours. So I now feel comfortable showing you all a tour of my new home, my new garden, and I'm so excited to show it to all of you. But that means that this is the last video in this current garden, and this was my first garden. When I moved into this home, I was really into houseplants, but I was not into gardening outside. So this garden is the garden that taught me to be a gardener, right? This is the garden where I tried everything, I failed at everything, I experimented with things. This is the garden that taught me everything. And what I wanted to do for my last video in this garden is I wanted to talk about the lessons that this garden has taught me, the lessons that I've learned from my first garden. And hopefully those of you that are newish gardeners, hopefully you all can learn a little bit from these lessons. And those of you who are seasoned gardeners, mature gardeners, and have gardened for years and years, longer than I've gardened for, hopefully this is just a really good reminder for all of you in your own gardens. So I have a list right here. I made a list this morning of all the lessons that I've learned, and it was so easy to make this list. It was like, it just came pouring out of me as I was thinking about it, because this garden has taught me so incredibly much. And I will always have so many fond feelings about this garden because this is where I learned everything. So my first lesson that I've learned in this garden is, and I've said this many times before, plan to fail. Plan to fail. Those of you, those new gardeners, you new gardeners that are watching this right now, plan to fail. You're gonna kill plants. You're gonna kill more plants than you can imagine. But even the most seasoned, mature gardeners, you can chime in the comments, we all kill plants. There are so many factors that could go wrong in nature. You can do everything by the book, you can do everything perfectly, and you still might fail at something, right? And I read a quote, I'm not going to say it correctly, I'm not going to say it verbatim, but basically the best gardeners are those of us that get up and do it again even after failing, right? Like, get back on that horse and try again. That's what makes a good gardener. There's no such thing as a green thumb. It's just someone that keeps trying and is not afraid to fail in the garden. So I cannot even tell you all how many times I have killed plants in this garden, how many times I've completely failed, how many times I've completely blown it. And I think that the reason for my success as a gardener is that I didn't get discouraged from failing. I just learned from it and I just moved on and I've tried again. And that's one of the great things about gardening, is it's yearly, it's cyclical. You can try again next year, or you can try again next month, or you can try again next week. You can just keep trying again and again and again until you feel comfortable with it. So my first lesson that I learned in my first garden is plan to fail. The next lesson I learned in this garden, I think, is a really important one that a lot of us don't want to hear, and that is, don't make your garden into something it's not. Don't make your garden try and be something it's not. What I mean by that is, I live in Northern California, zone 9B. I live in a very hot, a very dry climate, and I will watch a lot of YouTube videos, or I will see a lot of shows, or I'll see in books, I'll see all these beautiful plants that are thriving in climates that have way more humidity than I do, or don't get as hot as I do. And I look at the plants, or I look at the gardens, and I think, oh, I want that. That's what I want in my garden. And I try so hard to make my hot zone 9B garden into maybe a zone 6 garden, or even a zone 8 humid garden, right? Laura from Garden Answer, I love her garden, but she's zone 6. And Jim Putnam from HortTube, I think he's zone 8, right? Which is closer to me, but he is so humid over there in the Carolinas, which is a total difference as compared to my California garden. So when I first started out, I was trying to fit plants into my garden that that weren't gonna work. And it was okay as long as I knew that it was going to be a struggle and it was going to be tough and I was probably gonna fail more times than not. But if I found a plant that was meant to be in my climate, a plant that was, you know, maybe not native, but maybe like a nativar in my climate, it was just gonna be so much easier and I was gonna succeed. And they're beautiful too, just like the plants that aren't in my zone. So learning not to make my garden something that it's not was a hard lesson to learn, but I'm so glad I learned it because now I can make kind of an educated decision on the plants that I'm going to put in my garden from now on, depending on how much time, energy, effort, water, shade I want to give to a plant. You know, I have to know not to try and make my garden into a zone 6 garden or a zone 8 humid garden. My garden is a zone 9B garden. Your garden is its own garden. There are going to be certain plants that do fantastic for you, and there are going to be certain plants that do fantastic for me. The next lesson I learned in this garden is not to start too early. And I need to hear this every year. What I am talking about is I'm talking about the last frost date. So the last frost date is when, you know, there's a 70% chance, depending on what chart you're looking at, there's a good chance that you are not going to have another frost or killing frost in your garden. And that means you can start planting plants, right? Now we have a very early last frost date. It's usually at the end of February. Sometimes it's even earlier than that. But just because we're not having another frost doesn't mean it's warm enough. And you have to think of all the plants that I'm planting in my garden. They're a lot of times heat tolerant, drought tolerant. They like the sun, they like the summer, and they don't like cold soil. So a lot of times I will get really excited. I know I'm not alone in this. I will get really excited and look at the forecast and say, oh, there's no more frost. I'm gonna go plant all my plants outside and they should be fine. But what actually happens is the plants just sit there in the cold soil. There's no frost, but there's also no warmth. So those plants sit there, they're tiny, they're more susceptible to disease, they're more susceptible to rot, they're more susceptible to everything bad, and it just makes life harder. Had I just waited a month, a couple weeks for weather to warm up, had I just been patient, that plant was going to do so much better in the long run because it wasn't sitting there being susceptible to any type of disease. So I think a lot of us as gardeners get really excited. We sow our seeds indoors too early. We plant plants out too early. We plant our annuals out too early. We just get so excited in the late winter, early spring, which I totally get. But we have to remind ourselves not to start too early. It's a waste of time, and it actually makes our jobs as gardeners harder. So that is something I've learned. I think it's really important, and you're gonna see me mess up with this every year. I'm probably gonna start too early every year, but sitting here, hindsight is 20/20, right? So I know, do not start too early. Just remember that. Don't start too early. I'm telling myself that. Don't start too early. Next lesson I think is really important for us right now. We are in the dog days of summer. It's hot. It is like 7 a.m. right now, and I can already feel the temperature starting to go up, to increase today. And we just cannot be out in the dog days of summer when there's triple-digit temperatures. I don't want to be out in my garden during those times. So the lesson that I've learned is that gardening is cyclical or seasonal, I guess is what you can say. So the really exciting time for gardening, at least for me, is right after Christmas, right? So you start with January, and that's when you start with the planting, and then you start with this indoor seed sowing, and then you get so excited and you want to start early, but don't start early. And you know, then comes spring and you're outside and it's not too hot and you're just so excited about nature and flowers and all that fun stuff. And then as time goes on and you get into July and August, for us here in California, it gets so hot and you're tired and you don't want to do it. You don't want to go out into the garden. You just want to sit inside in the air conditioning, or you want to go lay by the pool or something like that. And that is okay. It doesn't mean you don't love gardening. It doesn't mean you're not a gardener. It just means it's the low season for us. It's the season where we're not as excited about being out in the garden because we've done all the things that we need to do for the year. And now it's our time to appreciate and kind of bask in the color and the season of abundance that we have. So this time of year, I feel like a lot of gardeners kind of get burnt out, is a really common phrase that I hear. And I think that we need to kind of rename it. It's not burnt out, it's just our low season. It's our time to rest season. And I know once we get into the winter, it's time to rest as well. But in the winter, I'm actually excited about gardening, and I'm thinking about gardening and planning. So this is a time of year where I think we need to calm down, and we need to be okay with calming down in our gardens and let our gardens do what it needs to do and be in its season of abundance. So kind of on that note, that gardening has seasonality. And the other thing that I've learned, the other lesson that I've learned that I wanted to mention was gardens are not meant to be perfect. This is another one that I need to hear all the time. When I see pictures on Instagram, or when I see videos on YouTube, or when I see pictures in books, those pictures have been those plants have been perfectly groomed to look the way that they do. I bet you $1,000 the next day there's going to be a weed, or there's going to be a petal on the ground, or it's just not going to look as good as it did in that picture. And if it does, more power to you. I don't know how to do that. My point is gardens are not meant to be perfect. Nature is not perfect. There's no point to try and fit our garden into this perfect, pretty picture that has no weeds and it's perfectly mulched all the time and there's no old flowers that you need to deadhead. It's just not feasible. So this is something I need to tell myself all the time. Gardens are not meant to be perfect. They're meant to have flaws, and really that's what makes them beautiful. We will never see the beauty of a flower if we didn't see maybe the weed next to it or the dead plant next to it. It's that bad stuff, or the not so pretty stuff, that makes that blooming flower so beautiful and so important and special to us. So I actually learned this lesson very early on because I started gardening during the pandemic, and I used to be in healthcare. I do not work in healthcare anymore. My husband still works in healthcare. But during the pandemic, it was incredibly stressful for those of us in healthcare, as I'm sure it was stressful for a lot of other professions. But I just remember almost being at my breaking point. And the only place where I felt like I could calm my brain down, calm my mind down, and really be mindful and be present was when I was working out in the garden. And I just think the lesson is that the garden is such an amazing place to be mindful. And it's such an amazing place that can help with our mental health. You don't even have to garden. You can just go sit outside in nature and look at the plants and get away from the news and get away from social media and get away from your job and just really focus on the beauty of nature. There's just something about it. I don't know what it is. There's just something about it that just, like, it just soothes me. It soothes my soul. And maybe that's because I am a gardener at heart, but I've just learned that gardening is so good for my mental health. When I get stressed or when I get overwhelmed, you know, I've realized I haven't been out in the garden lately. I haven't been out every morning. I haven't even walked through my garden maybe. And so all I have to do is go sit outside, sit in my garden, be around nature, and I feel 1,000 times better. All right, the next lesson is, it's kind of funny. There's kind of a backstory to this, how I learned this lesson. Gardens take work. Beautiful gardens take a lot of work. And my point for saying this is I used to work out in my front garden, and I live in a neighborhood, and a lot of people walk their dogs, ride their bikes, you know, kind of walk by. And a lot of people would say to me, what plants do I need to plant to get my garden to look like yours? Or what plants should I choose to get my garden to look like this? I want my garden to look like this. What plant should I pick? And you know, at first I'd be like, oh, I really like this plant and you should try this plant. And then I realized what they're asking is actually the wrong question. What they need to ask is, how much time do I need to spend in my garden to make it look like this? Because it wasn't the plants that I was choosing necessarily that made my garden look the way it did. It was the amount of care and the amount of time that I spent out in my garden that made it look the way it did. So gardens take work. They're not easy. They're not something that you can just hire someone to put in a whole bunch of plants and that's it, right? You can hire someone to put in a whole bunch of plants, but you have to maintain it as time goes on for it to continue looking that way. So unfortunately, or fortunately, however you want to look at it, gardens are living things and they take time and they take effort. And if you want it to look pretty, you're going to have to put effort in. And I kind of think of it as doing laundry. You are never done doing laundry. You can do all the laundry in your house, and by the end of that day, you will have more dirty laundry because of the laundry you wore that day. So you're never done. So if you continue thinking of it as something that you need to finish, then you're never going to be satisfied with how on top of the laundry you are. You have to think of the laundry, there's a point to this, I promise. You have to think of the laundry as just a process that you do in your life. And that's kind of what you have to think of your garden. It's just a process. It is the journey. It is not, it's not the destination. It is the work that you have to put into your garden, and beautiful gardens do take work. Next lesson I learned was a hard one, and that was that your garden is an ecosystem and it needs to stay in balance. And what I mean by that is the garden, there's so many elements in a garden, and it needs to be in balance for it to be a healthy garden. So when you come into, say you have white flies, and this is the example, this is how I learned this lesson. Say you have white flies and you want to do something about your white flies. And so you go out, not knowing any better, and you get a systemic pesticide, yes, and you go out into your garden and you spray everything to get rid of the white flies. Well, then that also gets rid of all the beneficial insects, and so then that kills the beneficial insects. So not only do the white flies come back, but then the aphids come back, and all the bad beetles come back because you have messed up the ecosystem, right? And so it's kind of the same thing as when you're selecting certain plants. If you put a plant that loves water next to a plant that also loves water, the one that loves the water more might take more of the water, and then this one might not get as much water. I hope that this makes sense. Basically, your garden needs to be in balance, and you have to think about having a balance in your garden between the good things and the bad things, the water hungry and the not so water hungry, the amount of chemicals you use, and the amount of bugs you're willing to deal with. There's a lot of examples of this in the garden, and you just have to think of your garden. It's not all or nothing. It's balanced, it's an ecosystem, and if you do something that's going to mess that ecosystem up or mess that balance up, you're gonna notice it in your garden. So just remember that if you leave your garden alone and kind of let it do what it needs to do, most likely it will even itself out, and you will see the benefits of that. So I just think that that's an important reminder. That is a hard lesson that it took me to learn. It's not just about pesticides and not using pesticides. It's about everything. It's just about the underlying thought process of your garden is an ecosystem and you need to let it stay in balance. All right, so the very last lesson that I learned in my first garden is that there is so much gardening advice out there, and don't feel bad if you don't listen to it. And that includes all the advice that I've given you over the last 2 years. So I feel like gardening, those of you that have had babies, those of you that are mothers or fathers, and you've gone through that process of trying to learn how to have a baby and what's the right thing to do, there are so many experts and people who tell you this is the right way to raise your child. This is the right thing to do with your baby. Do it this way, do it this way, do it this way. And once you have kids, once you get onto your second kid, you learn there's that way, and then there's the way that you feel comfortable with and the way that works for you. And it is the same thing with gardening. There's always someone out there that's going to tell you what to do and tell you the right way to do it. And unfortunately, there are people out there that shame people for for not doing it the way that they think is the right way. And I think that is the worst thing in gardening, is that those people that shame other gardeners for doing something different, right? Of course, there's a better option for a lot of things, but nobody should be shaming anybody. We're all learning. The greater good is to have more gardeners in this world, have more people garden in their properties, you know, however small it is, and more people reaping the benefits mentally and physically and emotionally of gardening. So my point for saying this lesson is it took me a really long time to understand, just as it took me a long time to understand not to listen to all the advice that I read about raising children. I don't need to listen to all the advice that I read about gardening, right? You have to kind of look at it and you have to take everything with a grain of salt and recognize that might be a really good piece of advice. It doesn't mean that I have to follow it, right? And so I just think that that's really important. Find your own way in your garden, find your own method, find your own techniques. We all live in different environments, we all live in different ecosystems, we all have different lives, we all have different jobs and time that we can do, and something that might work for you might not work for somebody else, and vice versa. So there's a lot of advice out there. You don't have to take all of it. All right, everyone, so that is going to be it for the lessons that I've learned in my first garden, and that is going to be it for this garden. It has just been such a pleasure to garden here. It was just meant to be. When we purchased this home, I knew that this garden was something special, and I am just forever thankful for what I have learned in this garden. And hopefully this video can help share that with those of you. So I hope you all enjoyed this, and I hope you all have a chance to get in your garden today.